Hi, welcome to INB 420 Week 6. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're talking about wealth and politics this week and the effects of wealth on politics. We'll start off with economically developed countries. That is countries obviously with a high level of economic development, infrastructure, political, economic, military systems, highly developed. We're going to start with a term called Global North. That is, most of these EDCs are located in the northern hemisphere. The less developed countries, the LDCs, are the countries and economies that rely heavily on production of agriculture and raw materials, and per capita GDP, gross domestic product, and standard of living are substantially below Western standards. That's the global South. LDCs, most of whom are located in the southern hemisphere. So we're starting off here with a geographical difference. And so LDCs and EDCs being in the north, LDCs primarily being in the south, although there are some exceptions, as there always are. Now let's talk about gross national product, GNP. It's the sum of all goods and services produced by a country's nationals, whether they're in the country or abroad. So it's not just restricted to that which is produced in that country, but it can be elsewhere through extensions and businesses elsewhere. GDP, gross domestic product, measure of income within a country that excludes foreign earnings. All right, the next concept, purchasing power parity. You see, we're coming with a lot of acronyms. PPP, purchasing power parity. Say that real quick. It's the measure of relative purchasing power of different currencies. Obviously, there's so many different currencies that are involved in exchange rates, and so this parity of purchasing power is something that we need to look at. Current dollars, the value of the dollar in the year for which is reported. And I will say a point here on the dollar. The dollar, has become over time the currency, the U.S. dollar, the currency of the world for trade and exchange. Again, there are exceptions, but the U.S. dollar is usually the currency of choice throughout the world for trade and exchange. Real or constant dollars, dollars that have been adjusted for inflation. Okay, now we're going to talk about economic nationalism, the realpolitik theory that the state should use its economic strength to further national interest. Imperialism, you've obviously become familiar with this term from time to time, and countries that feel subjugated by Western economic powers and Western powers like the U.S. like to throw out the word imperialism. What imperialism is it was the European powers actually in the 19th century, for example, England, that controlled and subjugated a lot of countries in different hemispheres with their economic and political and military power. Neocolonialism, notion that EDCs continue to control and exploit LDCs. So there's this conflict, there's this tension, and we've talked about it in previous weeks, but it's there. It's the haves and the have-nots and the struggle between the two in different forms. Internationalism. What is internationalism? The liberal internationalism holds that entities can conduct international economic relations cooperatively. Capitalism, as we're going to use it, is economic system based on private ownership of the means of production and distribution of goods, competition, and profit incentives. And I'll also say, you may become familiar that capitalistic societies have been criticized by some non-Western countries, for the practices that are all interrelated here. We're talking about the haves and the have-nots and the EDCs and LDCs. You'll hear the term capitalism just as you heard the term before, where there was criticism with colonialism. So you'll hear those are almost interchangeable. So you'll hear those in the international debate from time to time. Now I'm going to ask a question here. Does the Tea Party have something in common with the Occupy Wall Street movement? So obviously you can't respond, but this is just a video presentation. But think about that, because actually 61% of Tea Party members believe free trade has hurt the U.S., and supporters of the Occupy Wall Street movement oppose ratification of the free trade pacts with Colombia, Panama, South Korea, and others. So they do both end up at the same place. So, whether they start out from either far left or far right, or far right or far left, depending on how you're looking at it, they wind up at the same place and opposing some of from the free trade from both sides. Let's go back and talk about critical radicalism. What is critical radicalism? Dependency theory, belief that industrialized North created a neo-colonial relationship with the South in which the less developed countries, the LDCs, are dependent on and disadvantaged by their economic relations with the capital industrial countries. So basically, what does this boil down to? It boils down to the belief of the LDCs that the EDCs are taking advantage of them. It's as simple as that, and it's as complex as that, because there's a lot of things that go into those relationships. Primary products of radicalism is agricultural products and raw materials such as minerals. Critical radicalism, again, continue manufacture goods, items that require substantial processing or assembly to become usable. And what's the world systems theory within that? The view that the world is something of an economic society brought about by the spread of capitalism, characterized by a hierarchy of countries and regions. International investment. Let's talk about investment. Foreign direct and portfolio investment. What's FDI? Foreign direct investment. It's one country buying stock, real estate, and other assets in another country with the aim of gaining a controlling interest in foreign economic enterprises. An example, obviously China. It was in the U.S. It was Japan in the U.S. in the 80s. And there was a lot of great concern. A lot of the assets, the big capital assets, were being bought by the Japanese. Well, the Nikkei, the stock index for Japan, and other economic factors caused a downturn in the 90s for Japan, and now in the mid to late 90s and through the 2000s, you've seen the rise of China doing the same thing, buying capital assets. Their economy's been on a big upswing. I may suggest, and it's arguable, that there is this big upswing as China is becoming geared into the 21st century with manufacturing and production. But just as there's an upswing, there'll be a leveling off at some point. So this foreign direct investment, a great example is China in the U.S. International investment in multinational corporations. We come back to MNCs, multinationals again. We've talked about this many weeks previously. It's private enterprise that have production subsidiaries or branches in more than one country. So again, the reason we keep talking about it is multinational corporations have such a big influence on the world scale and on the economic scale. Well, look at this chart here. I think it's of interest. Multinational corporations versus countries' wealth. You see it's in GCP and GNP in the billions, and you see the U.S. estimate 2011 $15.06 trillion, and you see that really dwarfs many of the other countries. See Russia there at 1.48 trillion, but everyone else is under $1 trillion. So it's interesting to see Walmart at 422, Exxon 354, comparable to most all other countries that are on this chart, except for the U.S. and Russia, as far as their wealth compared to an entire country's wealth. And another example that I can give is this past year, Apple, when their stock in 2013 and into 2014, when this video was made, Apple's stock had grown as such where their value of their stock was equivalent to some small countries in Western Europe, as far as they were worth 500, I think it's $550 million was their positive net worth, which is, more than the Walmart and the Exxon there. But the stock had gone up and increased and dividends, and the world has smartphones and iPhones, as we know, not exclusively Apple, but based on their success, they had eclipsed some small countries, and in Western Europe, just their wealth was as much or more than entire countries. So that is something to think about. The power that these corporations have when they have this vast amount of wealth is equal to a country or greater in some respects. Let's look at another graph: dollar versus yen euro exchange rates. The yen and the euro there is in purplish, and the yen is in blue, and you look at the exchange rate and how the graph that charts out every time, and this is per dollar, yen per dollar average on the left axis against euros per dollar on the right. So you see kind of a comparison there, and so that's something to to look at and just know that the ebb and flow of these currency exchanges. Dominant global economic institutions, the IMF. We've talked about the IMF before. In regards to development this week, there's criticisms of the IMF that the policy of the IMF and the World Bank and other financial agencies to attach conditions and grant and to their loans and grants. So the IMF does loan money, but they do, like banks, attach conditions to it. So they do operate in a like a normal bank in that sense, but they're dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars of loans to countries. So they do attach conditions that have to be met. IMF generally promotes a capitalist model. That's not unusual. IMF conditions often harm economies and LDCs. That's what the criticism is, that the IMF is subjugating or keeping the LDCs, the lower developed countries, in their spot, stay in your place by putting these conditions that they have to meet, maybe a higher interest rate, or maybe before they get the loan, they structure it where they get so much then they have to complete it before they get the rest of the money or whatever. But the point is, there's criticism there that the IMF is basically acting as an arm of the EDCs, and that's a common criticism. The defense of the IMF. Required reforms are necessary to correct problems that lead to borrower country in financial difficulty. Promotes global prosperity. It allows LDCs to come up and improve. So there are criticisms and there are positives. It's again a balance. You see, depending on a viewpoint, you can come out on either side or more often in the middle. Development cooperation. The World Bank Group is another institution we'll look at. World Bank operations, how do they work? Equity funding for expansion of established and profitable firms, which is generally less risky and more rewarding than funding new ventures. So the World Bank, the IMF, they work to try to develop projects in LDCs to try to improve their plight. World Bank Group controversy about the World Bank. EDCs, again, dominate the World Bank, just like the IMF. Again, same kind of criticism. Using wealth-based voting formula. In other words, those that have the greater wealth get the greater say and the greater vote. Provides too little funding. Again, that's like the IMF. They're saying neither the World Bank or the IMF are providing enough funding for the LDCs. What about the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD? Again, some more terminology. The OECD facilitates exchange of information, otherwise promote cooperation among the economically developed countries, among EDCs. So there's kind of the EDCs working together in conjunction. The G8, I'm sure you've heard of this, I'm sure you know this, but the group of 8, the G8, they were G8 summits every several years, sometimes as needed every year. The G8 summit, it consists of Canada, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Japan, and the U.S. plus Russia. So mostly Western powers. Russia was added. There has been some development when recently in 2014 where Russia was excluded due to political interventions in Chechnya and some of the republics, so former Soviet republics. So sometimes, even though they historically were not in the G8, they've been in it the last 20 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, but here in 2014 they were excluded at a meeting because the other 7 countries didn't like what Russia was doing with some of its former republics. So you see the interplay of politics, world politics, economics. It's all intertwined. It's all works together. What about bilateral trade agreements? That is between 2 countries, obviously, 1-to-1, China to the U.S. Obviously, there's a big trade disparity, for example, in China having a big trade advantage and big imbalance. We're importing Chinese goods, and to the rate that we export to them is minuscule in comparison. So there's this continual trade imbalance year after year. Rapid expansion of BTAs, bilateral trade agreements between countries, and between RTAs and individual countries. That's regional trade agreements. RTAs are regional trade agreements. And it may harm the South's economic development. In other words, it's kind of the idea that, well, if you have a bunch of BTAs, bilateral trade agreements, and RTAs, regional trade agreements between EDCs, the developed countries, that's going to presumptively keep the South and the LDCs down and keep them pinned down. So again, come back to that same argument. Well, that's all for week 6. We'll look forward to seeing you in week 7. Thank you.